Before we start, if you're enjoying these conversations, please make sure that you like, subscribe, and leave a review or comment for Cleaning Up. It really helps other people to find us. Also, subscribe to us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode, and follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram, where you can watch highlights from each episode, read my takeaways, and keep up with all things Cleaning Up. And finally, don't forget to visit cleaningup.live, where you can access over 150 hours of conversations with extraordinary climate leaders, and you can subscribe to our free newsletter. That's all on cleaningup.live. Now, let's get started. Cleaning Up is brought to you by our lead supporter, Capricorn Investment Group, the Liebrecht Foundation, and the Gilardini Foundation. Hello, I'm Michael Liebrecht, and this is Cleaning Up. My guest today is Kirsty Gogan, who first joined us in Season 1, Episode 5, back in August 2020 in the depths of the pandemic. Kirsty is the managing partner of consultancy Lucid Catalyst and co-founder of TerraPraxis, an NGO advocating for solutions to climate change. She's done extensive work on the economics of nuclear power and is one of the most significant figures pushing for its inclusion in the global energy mix. In her first appearance on the show, she and I had a pretty robust discussion about the economics of gigawatt-scale nuclear new build. That made for one of the most popular episodes of Season 1. So, here we are 2.5 years later in Season 9, and I thought we should check back in with Kirsty to see if this time round she and I find more areas of agreement. So, please join me in welcoming Kirsty Gogan to Cleaning Up.
Kirsty, welcome back.
Thank you.
So you were one of our first guests on Cleaning Up, episode 5 in August 2020.
Very honoured I was. Thank you.
It was one of our most popular episodes, probably because we got in a bit of a fight about nuclear project cost. I'm sure we'll do the same.
No, it's a robust discussion.
We had a frank and robust discussion, I believe the diplomats call it. What I'd like to do today is look back over the 2.5 years since you were last on the show. There's been a lot of water under the bridge. A lot of things have happened.
Yeah.
Some of them are helpful for nuclear power and some of them less helpful. So we'll look at both. And then we'll finish by looking forwards and seeing, well, can we put down some markers for what might happen between now and who knows, 2.5 years, or maybe we might have you back next year if you don't get into too much of an argument.
Sounds perfect.
Okay, excellent. So look, the big news story of the last, that has affected all branches of the energy sector is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that has really, that's reset the board in so many different ways. How do you interpret what its implications are for nuclear?
Yeah, I mean, we were already seeing, even at COP26 in Glasgow, a sort of changing climate around the discussion for nuclear energy. But then, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, really just exacerbated that. It was already, I think many governments around the world, in light of the energy crisis that was already happening, remember that summer and that year after the pandemic, there was a sort of resurgence in the global economy. But then the Russian invasion of Ukraine really sort of put the spotlight on energy security and price volatility around the sort of dependence on gas. And that led to, many countries around the world, Japan, Belgium, and others reversing their phase-out plans for nuclear energy. But it also led to, countries becoming much more proactive, much more clear about their commitment to new nuclear builds. So in Europe now, since then, we've seen Finland and Sweden and the Czech Republic and Romania, and the UK as well, and the Netherlands committing to nuclear new build. And that's, not just in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously, but it is really a sort of, wake-up call around the world for the importance of energy security and affordability, and then, of course, decarbonisation.
Yeah, so a lot has happened because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it's important to remember that it's not just that, because we, I think, last met at Glasgow COP26,
yeah,
and we were both pushing for instance, the EU to add nuclear to its clean taxonomy. But it was hard work, wasn't it? It has become a lot easier to make that argument since
Since the invasion. I mean, it took more than 2 years for the European Commission to finally conclude that nuclear energy should be included in the sustainable finance taxonomy. And in some ways, the opposition to nuclear being included sort of had massively backfired, because what that led to was a very deep investigation by the European Commission's Joint Research Committee, which is the independent, very authoritative scientific advisory body to the European Commission, that produced, a 500-page report pointing to how nuclear energy is green, on every single metric that you care to mention, leading to a kind of irrefutable, solid evidence base, which was really needed around the fact that nuclear energy is in fact green and therefore should be included in the taxonomy.
That's right. There's that report, which I think we should put a link in the notes. It is an extraordinary report.
It really is.
If any group was going to find evidence that nuclear was more dangerous, less stable, this, that, and the other, than any other energy source, it's going to be that group.
Well, you name it. It's like on, water use, on land use, on carbon emissions, on spent fuel management, every single metric that you care about from an environmental and social sustainability perspective, the JRC concluded it's greener than any other technology.
The wording is quite marvelous. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it essentially says that there is no reason to conclude that it is less environmentally that it has a worse environmental impact than renewables or other energy sources.
That's right.
It's conclusive, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it's linked also to the fact that the Finns have also now established their geological disposal facility. The Swedes and the Baltic, they haven't used it yet. It's received regulatory approval. Right. So it's the safety case established, and now they're building it. Yeah. And that's a major milestone. In fact, DG Grossi, Director General of the IAEA, he went and sort of stood in the facility with his hard hat on and said, we have a solution for the waste. And, that's a major, major milestone as well.
Just sticking with the EU for a second. So the JRC says there is no reason to believe that it is, worse for the environment or for safety in any way than other energy sources.
Yeah.
But the EU is still not fully on board. We need now move on to the discussion about clean hydrogen.
Yeah.
And all the same people are saying, oh, no, it mustn't be nuclear. Why not?
I mean, I have to say, we are actually being, and you know this, Michael, we're being very generous in saying that the European Commission concluded that nuclear energy is a green technology, because it was so heavily caveated, the inclusion of nuclear, even in the taxonomy for electricity generation, that it's really unclear whether or not the requirements that were set in the taxonomy conditions are even, whether it's even possible to meet them. But now we're having the discussion about whether or not, hydrogen produced with nuclear energy should be classified as clean and green. And we're facing exactly the same kind of opposition from the, prominent anti-nuclear countries, Austria and Germany.
So that victory, getting nuclear into the taxonomy, it almost feels like it was a stay of execution. Not almost, because I think it's meaningful, but it wasn't. It was, it's almost the had it not been included, it would have been game over.
We won the battle, but we didn't win the war, I suppose, is the thing. Right. Yeah, right. No, exactly. And it really does make you wonder what the motivations are for these countries that are opposing the inclusion of nuclear energy in these initiatives. It's a sort of resource scarcity question. Are they afraid that that resources will be diverted away from renewables? When really what the thing that we should be focusing on is the outcome, which is that we need a lot of clean, reliable, and affordable energy.
So the day that we are recording this, filming, is the day that Germany shuts its last 3, and these are magnificent nuclear power stations. They produce a lot of clean energy. It's 6% of Germany's electricity, I think. Yeah. They shut them today. And you're asking a question, why? Why do you think they are shutting them?
Amongst the highest performing nuclear plants in the world, they're green giants. It's an absolute tragedy. It's shutting down all of Germany's nuclear fleet is equivalent to taking all of the wind and solar generation out of Denmark, for example. It's gigantic, and it's not only contributing to massive increases in carbon emissions. 1.5 billion tons of additional carbon emissions from shutting down the fleet. why are they shutting it down? Why are they?
I think my solidarity is that one of those plants actually generates almost as much electricity as all of Denmark's clean electricity.
Just one.
Just one of them. Maybe all three is all Denmark, including the non-clean that Denmark's doing. But
well, it's even worse than I thought then, right?
Huge. And
it really is.
So
what's driving that decision-making?
So I've called it a climate crime. That is also a crime against anybody with any sort of respiratory disease.
Yeah.
Germany, but not just in Germany. I mean, it is, provably in science. It has been shutting down these nuclear power stations early has been killing people in Germany and the surrounding countries.
It's been long enough now for the evidence really to be established, and there's many peer-reviewed studies.
The evidence is not controversial.
No.
I find extraordinary when I talk to, how can I put it, Germans who are, there are some that are very annoyed and upset about the shutdown, but the ones that have been championing it, they say, oh, Germany has been driving for renewable energy and coal is now coming off, and so we are doing both at the same time. What do you want to say to?
Well, they restarted 14 coal plants, during the last couple of years, partly in response to the energy crisis and partly in response to the fact that they're taking, massive amounts of clean energy off their own grid. They're also, of course, doing new deals with Qatar, for example. They've just signed a 15-year contract to import liquid natural gas. So, there's no way that Germany can claim that they're moving away from fossil fuels, anytime soon.
But they come up with this theory that the shutdown of nuclear has had no impact on the amount of coal burned. And, you hear it's all over social media and you'll told this endlessly. I mean, do you see any logic? Because it's mystifying to me, I'll be completely honest. Do you see any logic in that?
I mean, we know, there's enough evidence now from the United States, from Germany, that when you shut down perfectly good, prematurely closed, perfectly good nuclear plants, they are replaced. That energy generation is replaced with fossil fuels. It's replaced either with coal or with gas. And we know that, that Germany has a very large coal mining industry, and there are, industrial drivers here as well for Germany to continue burning coal, and, it's as simple as that.
I did find it, strange that Germany is held up as the sort of poster child of the Energiewende.
It's the dirty man of Europe. I mean, but for the size of its economy, Germany produces more emissions than any other country in Europe. So it's there's no question that it's a polluting country, and its reputation as a climate leader is being tarnished. Actually, that's one of the reasons why we think, and I'm speculating here, that we're seeing a resurgence in support for nuclear energy, even in Germany. So you see public opinion polling now that is in favor of maintaining the existing fleet. Too late now. They're closing it down today. And even, maintaining it and expanding it, because I think people are feeling the pinch. They're feeling the impact of the increased energy prices. They have the highest energy prices in Europe. They're also feeling, the reputational harm, that it's becoming really, it's becoming sort of irrefutable, the fact that actually...
Those pictures of the Lutzerat village, people protesting, they start to see the machines that wanted to sort of munch through the earth.
And the historic towns, that, really important.
It's historic.
Cultural history there for Germany.
So this is great because so far we're, furiously agreeing.
Violently agreeing with each other.
But one of the other things that's been going on in the last year and a half is collapse of the output of the French nuclear fleet, because the other poster child supposedly for all of the nuclear bros and stans and even the nuclear experts and advocates like yourself has been France. That's the way to get low carbon electricity. Collapse, which was incredibly badly timed.
Such bad timing. Terrible. Really painful for France, obviously, because, they're then exposed to the same pain that was being felt around the rest of Europe with, real questions about our energy security, particularly over the winter. And pain for the other countries as well, because France is typically one of the largest or the largest energy exporter in Europe.
Well, that's right. And if you look at households in the UK, which suffered and are suffering, it's not just the fact that Russian gas has been shut off, so the gas price has risen. It's also that nuclear, the fact that France is absorbing all of this electricity instead of exporting its nuclear power means that much more of what we're paying is gas at the margin, that gas price.
Those
Instead of being
no gas prices.
a few hours a day, it's right through the day.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could.
It's a real wake-up call, isn't it? It's a real wake-up call for, what our exposure to dependence on imported energy, whether it's imported Russian gas or indeed, imports from France, because of course France is going to, have a preference for supplying its own electricity, and that's going to have energy security implications for us.
The problem is interconnection, because it doesn't matter whether we're importing or whether we're exporting. If we're exporting, then all of our generators would have this fantastic opportunity to earn more by exporting. We would still suffer. As soon as you've got connected commodity markets, you're exposed to this.
Yeah, and I think it's a real, it's a real lesson, and I hope that we are going to be really paying attention to all of those implications when we're planning our, very interconnected, regional energy infrastructure.
But what's the lesson for the nuclear industry?
Yeah.
What's the lesson for France? What is France doing about it?
Yeah.
And what's the lesson? Because at the end of the day, you have this fleet of nuclear power stations supposed to be, reliable, resilient, clean, blah, blah, blah. Then half of them fail.
So two things, I think. Firstly, strengthen diversity. And one of the really key lessons here surely has to be that a more diversity in our energy mix is a good way to insulate ourselves from these kinds of risks. And secondly, the importance of maintenance, the importance of having more of a strategic view in the way that we're investing in our energy infrastructure is something that governments are, typically terrible at, because it does require, long-term planning and investments in future performance and reliability.
How do you diversify? How do you square the circle?
Yeah.
Because it's all very well saying we should diversify with lots of different things.
Yeah.
But out of the other side of their mouth, the nuclear industry is saying we're going to standardize and we're going to build loads of things that are the same. And as soon as you build the same thing, you can see it with cars, with vehicles, trucks.
How about competition? One of the things that's really lacking, one of the things that we really need in the nuclear sector is more diversity, more competition, more competitive supply chains, more suppliers bringing to market a range of different technologies. There's such a large market there for clean energy, not just in the electricity sector, but across heat and hydrogen and power and fuels that, could be met by a much broader range of suppliers than we currently have in the market today. And that's one of the ways in which we've driven down costs in the renewable sector as well.
It is, but the renewable sector has a sort of a machine that is working. In other words, they produce a product, sell a product, build some projects.
Oh, you just said the magic word,
right?
Products.
Yeah, but the nuclear industry has sort of done the opposite. Every time they've given them a project, they've kind of screwed it up.
Well, it's been a gigantic project. It's really what we're talking about is moving from projects to products, and the more products that we have in the market, the more that we'll have in efficiency and productivity in the supply chain, which drives down costs, increases rates of deployment, and then encouraging more suppliers to come into the market, which increases competition and diversity.
So I get that argument when it comes to SMRs, small and micro reactors, because there you have the chance of getting that kind of flywheel spinning in a positive way. I can understand. I think that there's a huge problem where the flywheel starts is very expensive because these things are so small, they're subscale, or they're small. Let's go with, don't want to prejudice the discussion. But let's talk about these big projects. And this is where we kind of went wrong in our last episode.
Yeah,
because I think that they are just extremely difficult to bring in on budget and on time.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about the work of Bent Flivberg, who's the leading academic in the world on project management. He's written this book called How Big Things Get Done, or actually could have subtitled it How Big Things Sometimes Don't Get Done, or Not on Time and on Budget.
How big things fail.
How big projects fail.
Yeah.
16,000 projects in his database now. And as an Olympic skier, I was very excited to see that the Olympic Games is one of the worst.
Right.
157% mean project overrun. By design, by the way, because the people who bid for Olympics, the cities that bid, always want to make it sound like it's really cheap. And once they win, start piling the costs on. That may not be what's happening in nuclear. But the worst in the energy sector, the worst overruns were nuclear waste storage, 238%, nuclear power, 120% overage. And this is not just Western projects. This is around the world.
Yeah.
Then you've got hydroelectric, 75%, oil and gas, mining is around 30%, fossil 16%, wind and solar 13% and 1% overruns. How do you come back from that? Because we were talking about this 2.5 years ago, and your argument was, we are rubbish at projects, please give us more projects, we'll get better. I'm paraphrasing.
That's a cheeky paraphrase, I have to say, but I'm going to let that slide. So the first thing is, I think you said it very well with the Olympics, that, you bid low and then you pile on your cost. And famously, of course, the Olympics in London came in on time and on budget because we doubled the budget and extended the timeline. Exactly. And then you say, look, ta-da, we've done it.
No, but they didn't.
But they didn't. It wasn't the same as when they started. And what the key lesson there is in the cost estimate that gets done in the first place. And generally speaking, one of the main key drivers, one of the key features of all of these projects that run over budget and are very delayed is that they start construction without a completed design. That's the fundamental mistake that has been made repeatedly, particularly in the recent experience in Europe and in the United States. They all did it. They all started building. They hadn't completed their design. That meant that the supply chain hadn't fully got their specifications. They didn't know what they were making. They were either making it wrong or they were being late. The regulator was getting involved and that was leading to all kinds of interventions that led to rework and having to stop and start work. And then crucially, the actual workforce on the site and the project leadership teams, weren't choreographing the build. So they were encountering all the time, problems that were, related to constructibility. They were sort of building the plane while they're flying it. That's the way of, best way of describing it. And guess what? That's going to lead to all of those features that you're describing.
So there's 2 points you're making. One is that they bid low for whatever reason, and they should, and therefore the overall's not really.
They haven't finished figuring out what they were building.
But if you take Hinkley, you see, most recently EDF has now issued a new estimate that it will cost £32.7 billion. I can't even remember what it was when it was supposed to, when it was actually. No, I don't have the data here. But had they said that in 2007, instead of talking about how cheap it was going to be in the cooking of the turkeys by 2017 for a Christmas dinner and so on, had they said that it will cost £32.7 billion, it's quite simple. Never have pulled the trigger on that project.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key drivers, obviously, in the cost of Hinkley in particular is you're paying 9% on your cost of capital, right? It's a very, very expensive financing arrangement that we have for Hinkley, and that is costing all of us money. There's no doubt about it. And then you combine that with, the very delayed, the extended construction period, which, I mean, to be fair, once it took 10 years to arrive at an agreement, firstly. So it wasn't delayed in the sense that once they started building it, it was delayed. I think actually the construction is going really quite well. And it was running.
Because pandemic, I believe.
I think the pandemic has, that's right, contributed to some slowdown, which is the case for everybody, and it's very understandable. But it's still a long period of time. It's still more than a decade of construction on which you're paying very high capital costs. So it's the cost of capital and the capital cost. So those are the two things that are driving really, and it's an Olympic scale project. So you want to speak about these big projects, and the bottom line is that if you have a very intentional, very focused, programmatic approach where you genuinely are moving your very experienced teams from one project to the next, and the supply chain is, in a drumbeat of delivery, as we've seen in previous programs, in France, in Sweden, in Korea, in Japan, even in the United States, we've seen, the majority of plants around the world being delivered in a program for $3,000 a kilowatt or less, really competitive, even with renewables and gas plants today. The question is, can we achieve that in the UK? I don't know. And the question is, will the developers, will EDF be tempted to change the design, reopen the licensing case, and will we have a timely sequencing that actually, retains all of that capability? That those things remain to be seen.
But isn't the very nature of these projects militating against that? Because they take so long. The idea that you're going to lock down the design and replicate.
You're building really big, complicated, highly regulated, high performance machines that involve a lot of concrete pouring, and it's those things. It's the civil works, it's the pouring of the concrete, it's the welding. It's those big complicated activities that cause delays.
But it's the welding.
It's not really the nuclear piece.
Well, you say that, but it's the welding and then figuring out that you haven't welded it right and having to re-weld. I mean, look at Flamel.
Nuclear grade.
Because that's what's really striking is
it's like, you want nuclear grade concrete, that will cost you 10 times more.
Well, and not one Western company is able to do this. And it's not just developing. It's not just China, but South Korea. There are delays even in their projects, and we don't know where the costs are being hidden for some of those projects. So you can name a number and say, they're doing it cheaply. They're really not. They just have non-transparent public accounting, which enables them to put costs, because there's enormous geostrategic value in doing this stuff. So you hide costs where you can.
I remember in China, I met somebody who's a master welder, and he made that decision at school, and trained, became an apprentice, and then has worked consistently and repeatedly for his whole career working on nuclear grade welding, and he's a master welder. That's the sort of level of generational investment in skills and capability that you need to achieve those, high performance low grade
welders, by the way. The UK has the best precision nuclear grade submarines, Barrow and Furnace.
Right.
I'm privileged to this.
Wow.
And it is astonishing, the technology and skills that we've got in this country.
Well, so one thing that I'd love to do is to move away from the big complicated 9,000 guys in a muddy fields construction projects to the factory-based opportunity where you can have precision welding, where you can have parallel processes, where you can have much more automation, where you can have a much higher productivity environment. That's where we make most of the big machines that we use in the world today. And that's our view is that's where we should be making.
Okay, let's go on to that in a second. I just do want to, before we talk about SMRs, and we did have Tom Sampson from Rolls-Royce SMR.
Right.
That moved on from Rolls-Royce, but we had him on this program episode. I don't have the number, but we'll put it in the notes. But before we do that, you've got Olkiluoto has now come online finally.
Yeah.
But it did cost 11 billion euros instead of 3. We've talked about
and took 18 years.
Are they going to build Olkiluoto 4? Because Parliament in Finland passed that legislation. They could, but are they going to, or are they going to just do something different?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? It's gonna contribute, I think, 30% of Finland's electricity. It will generate for at least 60 years. It may generate for as long as 100 years. It's making 90% capacity factor, clean, reliable energy. So it really, really tough. Getting that over the line. But once it's operating and going, it will run well, probably well into the next century. Now, big question, do they have the stomach to do another one? Is a good question.
I'm not an expert, but I'm told that with childbirth, when it has just happened, you say never again.
Yeah.
But then a few years later,
it's something funny happens in your brain chemistry, and you do it all.
Is that going to have a kind of brain chemistry?
Yeah.
Is Finland going to say, well, that was awful and overrun and ridiculous, but it's so wonderful that we're going to do another one?
Coming back to your, opening comment about, the impact of the war in Ukraine, I think Finland is really interested in its own energy security and energy resilience, and recognizes that having, big modern nuclear plants is going to be an important feature of that. However, I know that they are looking at SMRs, and it does seem as though there is a major shift happening in Finland, in Sweden, in Estonia, and Czech Republic, in Romania, in many of these countries around Europe, exposed to the risk of Russian aggression and overdependence on Russian gas, that they're looking at SMRs, partly because they're much smaller investments, that you can phase your investment. Instead of a $20 or $30 billion project, you're looking more at $1 or $2 billion investment. And there's potential for repeatability as well.
Detect less commitment to the gigawatt scale builds than when we spoke 2.5 years ago, because you you're defending them, but actually you're switching to SMRs quite a lot.
I mean, I can't help but sort of, make the case that the cost outcomes for the big gigawatt scale nuclear plants really are a choice, not, that you can achieve good outcomes. And I do think we need to replace our gigawatt scale fleet. But I think that the really big game is absolutely in small modular reactors and microreactors. But I would make a caveat that I want to see much more of a manufactured product-based approach for the small modular reactors, not just mini construction projects, which I think is a big risk.
Let's talk about SMRs. Tom Sampson of Rolls-Royce SMR, now no longer of Rolls-Royce SMR, but he was at the time.
Yeah.
That's a 470 megawatt modular.
It's a big, small reactor.
Big, small. And the reason it's modular is that it arrives in 2,000 truckloads and they get assembled on site. The GE Hitachi BWRX 300 that you mentioned, get geeky, is a 300 megawatt reactor. So is that similar? Is it going to, why is it modular? In what way, or is it?
Well, so Rolls-Royce obviously is, they're a manufacturing company, right? So that's a good start. They're good at, making things in factories, and there's many really good features about the Rolls-Royce SMR that it suggests that, a lot of the plant will be prefabricated, made in the factory, delivered to site. I think the sizing is informed by, how big can they go, but still move everything there by road.
Exactly. It's trucks.
It still sounds like a lot of pieces that you have to assemble on site, but, it's certainly not, as sort of scrappy as a, full on-site construction project where you're literally pouring the concrete.
I don't think there's that many welders that have to go to the site. I think there's still a few, but not.
It's very much assembly, and this is the, to be a bit geeky, it's the design for manufacture and assembly approach that, I think is very promising. But GE isn't quite as manufactured as that. GE still has a EPC-led, so engineering, procurement, and construction, to ensure we don't have any backends.
It's still a one-off.
It's still the plant's delivery is still going to be a construction project, and unfortunately, it will still, change for each site, and that's one of the big challenges, I think, that prevents these projects from becoming products.
Let's just touch on a couple of other players. You've got NuScale. How are they doing?
So NuScale is the first SMR to actually get a license. So, they're sort of forging the path for everyone else. They're first movers. It's cost $500 million and took years and millions of pages of, submissions to the NRC. So, really a kind of Herculean effort. And it does raise questions about, whether or not the regulator in the US is meeting its mission, not only to be safe, but also efficient. I think we're lacking in the efficiency, but they have got their license, and now they're marketing to many countries around the world that are super interested.
And that's something like 100 megawatts electric.
So it's 77 megawatts. However, they licensed, when they went through the licensing process, the design was 50 megawatts. They've now increased that to a more economical 77 megawatts, and they come in 12 packs. So you kind of get a plant, but each unit is 77 megawatts. They're going to have to be licensed to get their 77 megawatts delivered.
Now, we need to put that in perspective, because you and I make a lot for a living.
Right.
Not everybody listening to this does. And a big gigawatt scale nuclear, a big coal-fired power station would be 1.5 gigawatts, and you might put a couple of them together, like in Hinkley, it's going to be 3.2, is it? 3.6?
1.6 each, so
3.2. And so, if you're talking about 77 megawatts electric times 12, you're going to get to about a gigawatt. So it's kind of one normal power station, it sounds. But I did a calculation based on sort of new scale. I said, okay, let's talk about 100 megawatts electrical, and how many of those do we need to catch up with where wind and solar are today in terms of energy, in terms of electricity generation, not capacity.
In the UK? Globally?
I did the global number.
Now, are you talking about installed capacity for wind and solar, or are you talking about their generation?
Not capacity, because we know that you need 4 times the capacity and so.
Well, I mean, okay. So what are you assuming for solar? Are you assuming?
I'm not assuming anything.
10% capacity?
I'm not assuming anything.
Even the generating
terawatt hours that were generated last year. I actually have a little chart that I could show you. Because
I love a chart.
Yeah. No, that's the wrong chart. This one was how disastrous Flamanville has been. You can see that how it's delayed.
So
more
for the audience, the curve is going up, unfortunately.
Yes. More expensive and more delayed again and again and again and again.
Wow.
But that wasn't the chart that I was after. Yes, we need to, for the podcast audience, we need to do these in performative dance so they can enjoy them as well. Here, if you're watching on YouTube, you might be able to see global generation from nuclear and wind and solar. So you see, nuclear essentially stalled at about 2,800 terawatt hours in 2021, whilst wind and solar have obviously soared away and in 2021 overtook nuclear in output, not in
I'll say two things quickly about this chart. One is that what we only see there is the clean electricity generation in the global mix. What we don't see is the gigantic, sort of share from oil and gas and coal.
Well, not so much in electricity. It would be gas.
Coal.
Yes. No, listen, both of these are both technologies I support.
I know.
I'm just trying to put some...
But it's not a competition.
That's an interesting point. Maybe we come back to it. So I think in many people's minds it is, but I'm trying to triangulate here.
Yeah.
It is one way you need to triangulate. How big is it? How fast can you move? Those are, even if it's not a competition, I still need to understand which.
I agree with that. And, coming back to the strength and diversity piece.
I want to
go on.
I need to get
I know you wouldn't question
the number of these SMRs that you need to build. Right?
Yes.
There you see wind and solar curving up. They're now 15% of global electricity generation capacity, but generation. And if you wanted to do that with 100 megawatt SMR, you would need to build 5,400 of them.
Excellent.
5,400. So you'll say, marvelous, what a tremendous market. I'll say, really think you're going to get there?
Well, so what we saw on the chart was like a lovely hockey stick shaped curve, which is fantastic and an incredible achievement. For wind and solar. Absolutely wonderful. The question is it going to continue to be a hockey stick shape curve? Or, are we going to encounter, some other realities around the deployments of wind and solar globally?
Oh, I have no question on that. I have no doubt whatsoever that wind and solar output continues to hockey stick.
It's going to hockey stick.
It's going to, because we are getting bigger and bigger projects, offshore wind. We're getting these huge projects in the Australian desert. We're getting. I mean,
we're at 15% now. So what share do you think the hockey stick curve could go up to? Is it going to double again?
Oh yes, for sure.
Is it going to triple? Are we going to get to like as much as 50% share?
So I think it'll go. There's no question in my mind that hockey stick of wind and solar could get to 60, 70, 80% of global electricity. And by the way, it goes very non-linear. I've wrote something about there's solar singularity, but you can also do one for offshore wind. You get floating offshore wind, because don't forget that even if you got to 60, 70, 80% of current electricity, we've also got transportation, we've got industry, we've got heating, all going electric.
Yeah, I mean...
So I want to come back to the 5,400 small modular reactors. And by the way, if they are Rolls-Royce size, which is about 5 times as big, then the number becomes 1,100.
Can I take that for a second? Yeah, okay. So let me zoom in a little bit here to make it a little bit more sort of easy to imagine how we might deploy that kind of scale of nuclear. So we have a gigafactory design, for example, which is a 20 gigawatts electric facility. So it has 36 high temperature reactors located on a site which is similar. It's sized to be like a medium-sized refinery. Okay, so you can kind of imagine what a medium-sized refinery looks like. One of these sites could accommodate 36 of these high-temperature reactors, or indeed a light water SMR kind of technology.
20 gigawatts on the same site?
On the same site.
It's kind of cooling that.
Well, it depends on the technology. We wouldn't expect necessarily to be using water-cooled reactors. We might use lead-cooled or molten salts, or, there's different cooling technologies.
Maybe, but you reject the heat somewhere.
Yeah,
Still got to get that heat away.
cooling towers, for example. So cooling towers, or if you have if you're next to the ocean.
Are you evaporative or closed loop? I mean, it's just because these are vast challenges. I get these people saying, "Oh, we're going to just make liquid hydrogen at Heathrow Airport," and they don't understand the scale of heat you have to reject. It has to go somewhere.
It does. So in this scenario, we're expecting to have a huge bank of cooling towers available. If we were to do that for the UK, you would be making very large amounts of hydrogen, as you'd expect, for less than $1 a kilogram, because you're making the reactors, and you've got a factory producing all of the prefabricated, concrete there on site. You're locating everything into a fully integrated manufacturing and installation and production facility. You can use the hydrogen to make synthetic fuel, so you can actually move the product around. But crucially, you could also be connecting it to the grid. So if, let's say we're successful and we get our 80%, wind and solar generation for the electricity grid in the UK, what do you do during the Dunkelflaute situation? Then
Translation, that's the time when there's no wind and no sun for an extended...
You've got a cloudy, windless day that could last for weeks, even at a time. But even during those cloudy, sunless moments in the system, if you really need, if you have a very significant dip in your electricity generation because you have a weather-dependent electricity system.
That's all software and battery. The short-term stuff will go demand response.
There's demand response, and the phase shifting fine. But for your longer periods of time, your 12-hour, 24-hour cycle, and even for your week-long or months-long cycle, you could potentially then be directing that to the grid. And then you've got really good economics for hydrogen production, because you're making hydrogen 80% or more of the time, and you've got a very large-scale facility, so you've got good low costs associated with that large-scale facility, and then you don't have to invest huge amounts in energy storage to support your renewables.
So I agree with the architecture. I think that's right. I think pairing nuclear with industrial processes like electrolysis is the only way that I can see a robust role for. Because then, as you say, what happens then when you don't have the wind and the solar power, not only you could use some hydrogen or whatever long duration storage, but you've also got the nuclear. You shut off your electrolyzers, and at that point you've got a sort of double benefit. You've got the nuclear and you're using hydrogen.
A flex generation of hydrogen heat and power, essentially.
I guarantee you, I will bet you, even adjusting for inflation, which is considerable, you're not going to get close to $1 a kilo of hydrogen using nuclear power at 70 to 90 pounds per megawatt.
No, well, definitely not. But then if you have, but then what you're not doing is like a bespoke construction project. You have a factory making your products, essentially. So you're applying all of those high productivity manufacturing benefits that I was describing a minute ago, automation and parallelization and, a precision environment, and you're making a product that's the same over and over and over again. So you get into much more like a car manufacturing, airjet manufacturing.
$1 a kilo level. You need to get your electricity to
about $30 a megawatt.
No, it's much lower.
Or less.
I think it will be $10 per megawatt.
Yeah, okay. Let's agree on 20.
Maybe 20 if you're running it 24/7. Because it's $10 if you're slightly...
Yeah, and don't forget you're adding heat. So we're assuming solid oxide electrolysis, which is, increasing the efficiency of the electrolysis through the addition of heat.
So what you're postulating, though, is that it's an SMR, it's a small modular reactor, but actually it's a really big power plant. You're just going to put lots of them together, because I can't see how you're going to build 5,400 of these things in individual locations. So the whole idea of, we're going to have a data center.
Exactly. Thank you.
Nonsense, right?
Well, I mean, you might have actually MMRs, and I think there's really going to be a strong case to have these little heat boxes, essentially. If you think about them as little heat boxes that are delivered, sealed, they power the facility, whether it's a data center or some other industrial application, for a decade or even more, and then they're taken away again. There's no refueling, there's remote operation. These new technologies are... I was joking before, pointing at your old telephone here. What is
hotline telephone?
Yeah, I should put mine.
Just for those who are on the podcast, I have an old ring dial telephone behind us,
and I want to put my smartphone next to it, and to illustrate the point that there's such a big difference between the technology, your grandfather's technology, that the nuclear technology that's operating in the world today, and the technologies that are being commercialized and coming to market.
But still, for each of those locations, even if you say, oh, well, it's as simple as you've described it, and there's, that you install it and it runs for 5 years and then you remove it, right? You've still got, have a supply chain to produce it.
Yes.
A supply chain to produce its fuel.
Yes.
A way of removing it and remediating afterwards, and all of the siting and planning.
Yeah.
For 5,400 of these things.
And you would centralize a lot of the production, probably. If you're making heat and fuels, you could centralize, just like we centralize production of fuels today. So you wouldn't necessarily pepper pot them around the place of 5,000.
By the way,
individual
if I
locations.
challenge $1 a kilo hydrogen,
yeah,
I would challenge synthetic fuels. Maybe we might see some in use in aviation, because we really, really, really want to fly places.
We really love flying, don't we? And all the billions of people that are, increasing their quality of life are going to want to fly.
The EU has just fought this great battle about e-fuels and allowing them for land-based transportation, of which virtually none. Maybe if you want to have a kind of heritage Ferrari at some point, which I'm sure you do, then you might use an e-fuel. But the idea that the cost of e-fuel
vehicles, surely, the electric vehicles are amazing, wonderful, and I really hope that we are able to achieve this sort of scale of investment and sequencing in all of the associated infrastructure that's going to be necessary to establish the confidence for everyone to buy a new car. But I just want to come back to the quick list that you made a moment ago about, the investment that's going to be needed in the supply chain capability, the fueling production capability, the remediation, the siting, all of that capability that would be necessary to go and deploy those 5,000 SMRs that we need. That's the to-do list. That's exactly why. My question is, why wouldn't we do that?
Well, because it's much harder to get approval for 5,400 nuclear locations than for 500,400, name any other technology. That's just the reality. You can, we talked about...
Do you think that there is no risk that we wouldn't be able to get to, the 100% clean? Are you thinking
that the answer is go 100%?
Because if you think there is any risk to that 100% renewables, or zero
renewables is a foolish pipe dream. Those so-called academics pushing it are basically just activists who happen to have landed professor roles. That's my.
One of the reasons I love talking to you is because you're really a climate hawk and you really care about those outcomes. And I think that's something that we agree on. And the reason that I'm here saying, okay, there's our to-do list, this is the sort of activities we should be investing in and doing, is because I think that's a way of de-risking our path to net zero. There's a question about what we're doing about coal. Well, I just want to say that if you start looking at the opportunity to essentially replace the steam generation, but essentially stop burning coal and replace the steam with steam that's produced with an SMR, that could be a very promising way to enable those plants to continue operating without emissions globally, continuing to supply the energy. What we're looking at here is a sort of a fast track. It doesn't require the difficult transition of essentially abandoning those communities and trying somehow to replace the scale of generation from that single footprint with, thousands of acres of wind and solar that would be needed to replace the coal.
Can I ask a difficult question about this fast track?
Go ahead.
Will it arrive?
Is it fast?
2050?
That is a really good question. And, I think that one of the big challenges that we've had in the climate and energy discourse is an absence of real discussion around, the role that nuclear energy could potentially play and what actions would be needed to enable it to play a meaningful role. And, one of the ways that we're trying to sort of insert nuclear more into that discourse is by targeting it at really tough to solve parts of the decarbonisation challenge, like coal, for example.
I suppose I'm less worried about coal because I do see how it can be pushed out pretty easily. As long as you're not shutting existing nuclear, it actually gets pushed out within the energy system conversation reasonably easily.
Well, it's been phased out in, let's count the ways in which it's been phased out. So it's been phased out in Ontario. That's, I think, the only example of a modern industrialized economy that has successfully fully shut down its coal generation.
UK is extraordinary. It's very close.
It's very close, and we've maintained our nuclear fleet. Again, has maintained a nuclear fleet.
Even Germany, despite the fact that they're shutting nuclear, is now finally forcing coal off. And anyway, but
that's important, Michael, because that's really like the evidence isn't really there. It's still a hypothesis, and it's a hypothesis that despite 20 years of raising the alarm about climate action, we haven't successfully.
The UK had 40% coal in its mix, in its electricity mix in 2012. It now has 2%.
Yeah.
It's not a hypothesis. That's delivery. I want to come back to one other small modular reactor, if I might.
Okay.
There's a company called Last Energy.
Yes.
And they announced with great fanfare just very recently $18.9 billion to build 34 reactors, but their reactors are 20 megawatts. 20 megawatts, which means that they're suggesting that that's $28 billion per gigawatt when they want to build these things. I mean, you just do the math. So 18.9 billion, 34 reactors, that's 680.
Do they mean 34 projects? I think that may be that they mean 34 projects rather than per reactor.
Oh, that's possible.
I think that sounds G.
But are we going to see and can you ever justify a 20 megawatt reactor in that? I mean, there's 5,400 if they're 100 megawatts. You multiply by 5 if they're 20 megawatts. I mean, isn't this just kind of saying, oh, well, how can I put it? Isn't this hydrogen cars, hydrogen trucks? Let's have some, let's just kind of capture the zeitgeist and try and create something. I mean, what is really going on?
Well, there's a lot of, there's a lot of energy services that are needed in the world beyond electricity. And, this 20 megawatts plant, I think Last Energy seems to be doing a really good job at, generating a huge amount of customer demand, which, hats off to them. That's what this sector, frankly, needs. And I suspect, I don't know all of the details about what they're doing, but I suspect that a lot of the customers that are raising their hands and showing some interest that they're recording there are district heating systems, are industrial heat users, are major industrial power consumers. These energy services that are kind of, a little bit away from the public sort of perception, which tends to focus on household energy use and electricity use in particular. There's the other 80% of our energy needs out there that can be met through these kinds of funds.
I guess I might have a slightly more demanding definition of customer demand than somebody who puts their name on a press release.
Yeah, as I say, I don't know the details, but I know that there's
customer demand, but it's not real customer.
Well, I think a lot of big industrial energy users in the oil and gas sector and in the, chemical, steel, cement, glass industries, those big industries that, build all of the infrastructure that we need in the world are massive energy consumers. They have 2030 emissions reduction targets, and they're looking around to see how they're going to meet their need for not just power, but also for 24/7 power, and also for high temperature heat. And I think they're getting kind of interested in the role nuclear plays.
I can imagine oil and gas companies wanting to eliminate their Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions by going nuclear. I can imagine that's a thing, but I'm not sure if it should be.
I mean, it's why not?
Well, whether it will really happen, whether that is real demand or not, and whether those oil and gas companies ought to be, how can I put this, either doing things that will be much faster than waiting for these technologies of the future to arrive, or perhaps facing up to the fact that they are actually not going to be producing as much output as they seem to think.
So I guess my question is, why do you think it would be so slow? Like, what do you think is actually the underlying reason for the pessimism, the very understandable pessimism that you have that the nuclear technologies could achieve the sort of speed and scale of deployment that would be meaningful to these companies that have 2030s targets? Why is that?
So I talked about the supply chain for the technology. These are really complex. This is not manufacturing that you do,
This is a great reason.
Right, I cannot. But there's the supply chain to produce them. There's the fuel. There's the siting and permitting.
Yep.
There's the non-proliferation issues, which have to be.
Do you think those are solvable or not?
Do you know what? I think there are a lot more challenging than you think. And I'll give you an example, right? where does nuclear fuel come from? A large part of it, right?
Russia.
Comes from Russia. Why are we still buying? And the most recent data is we're still buying. The EU included is buying $1 billion a year of fuel from Russia. Right? Is this a good thing?
And do you know the stats on how much gas we're buying from Russia still as well, despite the so-called sanctions?
Yeah, well, we've got a few countries that have got no alternatives.
Yeah.
We're actually in the pockets, frankly, of Russia as a result.
And it's
you want to be in that situation for nuclear fuel.
And that is unfortunately the case with fuel. And now there is significant moves in multiple countries to stand up new fuels production supply. The question is, how can they do it?
Exactly. But how long does it take? Because I look at this and say these things take decades and decades.
Well, a lot of it.
You're saying, we should do it quicker. Well, yeah, okay. How?
Well, a lot of this comes down to exactly the same kinds of strategic intent that from governments and from industry, and the right incentives being created, as we saw with the successful renewables, improvements in competition and supply chain and productivity
But they're not the same. They're not.
Well,
this stuff is.
You're talking about a manufacturing capability.
It's not manufacturing. What is the proliferation risk of opening a wind turbine factory? What's the security implication? We're over dependent on China for rare earths, but we don't have to track every kilo of rare earth in minute detail because it goes into the energy industry.
We're really, really good at tracking that material, and we're really good at the application of all kinds of digital capability and security oversight that has led to the really impeccable track record in terms of safety, security, and safeguards. The operation of nuclear for the last 65 years.
Qualifying a new mine, qualifying a new processing facility, qualifying a new reprocessing facility, educating sufficient engineers to man all these.
I agree.
Is the job of decades.
That's why it's strategic. That's why it's strategic intent. When with the lesson from COVID,
Kirsty called it fast track. It's not fast at all. There's nothing fast about it.
No, I asked you what you thought the barriers were to achieving the fast track, and now we're discussing them. And this is exactly the kind of conversation that I think that we should be having, because this conversation is really about identifying the big challenges, and then we can start having a discussion about whether we can solve them, how we might solve them, what kind of investment of resources and, that kind of strategic intent might be necessary to solve them. But unfortunately, most of the conversations that are happening elsewhere are not even, at that stage. They're saying, no, it's too difficult, therefore we won't do it.
I don't think it's too difficult. I think it's difficult, and I think we should be doing it. But I think we've got to be brutally realistic about what it can deliver. How many of these SMRs can we build in what time frame and where, and with fuel from what? Is it going to use Russian, highly enriched helium fuel, or is it not? And that has to be, that's hard work. Next decade.
It is hard work. And Michael, if we were sort of having this conversation outside of the context of the climate emergency that we're in, then, I think you'd be very reasonable in saying, this is too difficult. It's going to take too long. It's going to, require too much investment.
But I'd still be supportive. Why? Because nuclear is needed in the food industry, medical industry, in the measurements industry. So I'm just pro-nuclear. I'm genuinely through and through pro-nuclear.
Yeah.
But I'm also pro-data and pro-realism.
Me too. And I'm looking back at the COVID pandemic, and I'm sorry if this is too much of an overused analogy, but to bring a vaccine to market before the pandemic, you would have said it will take 10 years. And it took 10 months because we were in an emergency, and the scientific community, changed its processes, created a lot of parallel activities, and designed a critical path that eliminated huge amounts of inefficiency and time that normally would have, led to the 10-year track. And I'm arguing that we should at least have a look at what the critical path could be to bring some of these technologies to market at the speed and scale that we need, and figure out where we can eliminate inefficiencies and where we can actually, speed things up. If we really think it's an emergency, 27 years to 2050, Michael, we
No, listen, I agree with you, and I agree with what you're saying about doing things in parallel and speeding things up.
Yeah.
I just think that you're talking about speeding, things that take 20 years, you could speed up to 10, 12, but not to 2 or 3. It just doesn't work that way.
Well, France built 57 reactors in 15 years.
Yeah.
So, there are historical examples of, Sweden and France built, and the US, they built, many, 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 many.
You do know we're adding more generating, not capacity, but we're adding more generation of wind and solar now than was ever added in any individual year in the past.
Which is fantastic. And what I'm saying is we should be having the same level of ambition for other clean technologies as well.
Let's finish because we could go into whole things about regulatory environments back then. That was before Chernobyl. That was before Fukushima. That was before.
That was before we had computers.
Exactly. So
really, I mean, it's not. I'm not trying to make some wild prediction here. What I'm trying to make the case for is really making good choices.
Let's move on to just a couple of other things before we wrap up, because I think we agree on a lot. I'm not as optimistic, but there are things that I am, sort of encouraged by. I love that Olkiluoto is finally working. I love that Taishan is finally connected back to the grid. I do like the progress on SMRs. I kind of like the bigger ones because I think that the idea of thousands of little ones,
of the little nuclear reactors,
I find that very sort of unlikely.
For a proliferation reason, or why is that?
Proliferation is a big part of it. I'm a foreign policy hawk. I don't like the idea of too many people having this stuff, lying around.
Yeah.
But also just the regulatory processes around every single site that's got a nuclear reactor are going to be. This is not like we talked actually about why isn't this just like building an aeroplane?
Yeah.
Answer is this is like building an aeroplane, and each time you build an aeroplane, you have to site and build a whole airport in terms of the public consultations, et cetera, et cetera. So, but some other things I've optimistic.
Well, although that the product developers, the developers of these advanced technologies, the micro reactors, and even some of the high temperature advanced reactors, they are designing out that need to build a whole airport around their technology.
They're not designing out the need for every single municipality to have to consult with the public, get everybody comfortable. Not just that municipality, they're going to have to work out where the fuel comes from. They're not going. You're not going to get around the fact.
That they only just decommissioned the research reactor at Ascot recently.
Yes.
I mean, yes, we had lots of these small reactors operating in our own towns and cities. Without anybody batting an eyelid. Where it's different to the research reactors.
We're going to spend 200 years decommissioning Windscale. So people will require scrutiny.
That's a old era. I'm not saying there shouldn't be scrutiny. I'm just saying that, there are already real world examples.
Exactly. And scrutiny takes time. Scrutiny takes, I'm afraid, scrutiny and building robust supply chains takes, I'm afraid, decades is what we've seen, from every sector that's come from nothing.
And permitting is being identified as one of the big.
Let's get back to some of the other things that are sort of. Let's finish off with some of the things that we agree are interesting. We've talked about the GE Hitachi, very exciting. We've talked about there's some things going on within some of the industries that are sort of espousing this. Microsoft. There are some that let's go back to the kind of public acceptance, because fundamentally, if the public wants this stuff, I think we'll get it, and if they don't, we won't.
I think that's right. I think one of the really interesting things about our TerraPraxis Repowering Coal initiative, we're partnering with Microsoft, and that's really incredible for a bunch of reasons. So firstly, of course, Microsoft has a gigantic global energy business. They're massive energy consumers. They're going to increase their demand for 24/7 clean power. They have a very ambitious target to be carbon negative as a company, not just carbon neutral. So they're very interested in the role that nuclear energy could potentially play in, as a power supplier for their data centers, for example. They also supply energy services to the global utilities, and they're very interested in supporting those customers in reaching net zero as well. Exactly.
A lot of energy services, but
a lot of IT services. Right. Exactly. That's right. And they see a really important role there for, for example, repurposing coal plants with SMRs. But anyway, the interesting thing beyond all of that sort of, global presence that we now have, thanks to our partnership with Microsoft, is that the perception that people have when they encounter the idea in the context of the Microsoft Technology Center is this is a high-tech solution to a big, bad, dirty problem. They don't see it in the kind of, nuclear, classic old-fashioned lens. They see this as being like a high-tech solution. And that's really exciting. And that changes the perception very much.
So now, when do you think that we will see whether nuclear is doing that hockey stick, the upwards hockey stick of not just talk and press release and so on, but actual output from nuclear plants? When are we going to see that hockey stick? So what I'm asking is, when should I have you back on cleaning up so that we can adjudicate between whether my, you would say pessimism, I would say realism, or you would say realism, but I would say optimism. Who's right, and how long do we have to wait to find out?
Yeah, that's such a great question. When do we actually start to see results? That's, I guess, what you're asking, isn't it? Like, when do we actually start to see, boots on the ground delivering these things? I think we're going to see micro reactors. So we have already SMR projects. So GE Hitachi is starting projects now with OPG in Canada, TVA in the US. We're seeing, other.
When will those be producing power?
I don't think they're going to be producing power before 2030.
I've got to get you back on the show before 2030.
I would love to do that. Yeah, we're going to be, I think actually that's a really interesting question because, the climate impacts, that the urgency, the sense of urgency at each COP and, globally each year becomes more and more. We just had the IPCC report earlier this spring.
The summary of the
summary for AR6 policymakers.
Assessment review.
And, the sort of the klaxon just becomes more and more sort of urgent each time, doesn't it? Where will we be in 5 years' time on a climate perspective, and how might that change the trajectory that you're asking about now? Will there be a kind of an intensification of demand that will drive some of the really significant changes that are needed in the way that we license, in the way that we prepare the supply chain, in the way that we invest in our fuel production, that could actually accelerate that hockey stick curve? I think we will see that in the next, 2 or 3 years.
So I think my answer to where we will be in 5 years in the climate debate is, I believe that we will have come to grips one way or the other with the fact that we're missing 1.5 degrees.
Yeah.
That there are therefore bad outcomes.
Yeah.
That there are people who are going to be suffering. But we will also have understood that we are not going to 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees of warming, and therefore that in some way, shape or form, we have to settle in for the long term. We have to keep it to 2 degrees, which will still be possible.
Yeah.
And we need to settle in for the long term and become less hysterical in our response. I'm not talking about individuals. I'm talking about as a society. We can't just jump on hydrogen is the thing, nuclear is the thing, wind is the thing.
Right.
We're going to have to settle down for a long haul to get to 2 degrees. Nuclear has its role to play. So do all the things I've talked about, wind and solar and hydrogen, which is a kind of the kind of alternative. But it's going to be all.
Yeah.
But we have to be, let's say, brutally realistic about timings. And by the way, at that point, 5 years in, I don't think nuclear will have delivered a whole hell of a lot more than it has today.
But I think I would bet that in 1 year from now, we will see a very significant shift in the customer voice, the demand for heat and hydrogen and power from nuclear energy for industrial decarbonization. I think that a lot of these large energy users that I was talking about, oil and gas and industry, are looking at their 2030 trajectory. Here we are in spring 2023, 7 years away to their milestone. And I think that in a year from now, we're going to have seen many more of those big players put their hands up and say, we want one of those, or we want 100 of those, or whatever it might be. Dow Chemical has already stepped up, and they're commissioning accelerator,
which we didn't talk about. That's very interesting. Accelerator, that's another good SMR, small modular reactor.
It's really interesting. And what's super interesting is that Dow had really, I hadn't realized this, but I learned recently, had been very active in the NGP program. I'm mispronouncing it, but there was a big small reactor initiative, DOE funded, about 20 years ago. And many of the individuals who were working on it at the time have now come all the way back around again and said, let's reopen this. And the timing is very different.
I wrote in 2018, I wrote a piece about how there were two business cycles, two planning cycles for businesses before 2030, because they take about 5 or 6 years. You can kind of make some bets, spend 5 years executing, and then you have to see whether they work.
And that's exactly the milestone.
We now have what you're talking about is you're getting to the point where there's just one more time to place the bet. There's one more roll of the roulette wheel before 2030.
And I think if the industry, if the nuclear sector misses that next roll of the dice or the roulette wheel spin, which is going to be this time next year, let's say, then I think we can we can forget about it. I don't think nuclear is going to.
Because here's how I think of it. I think
we can forget about it for 2030.
Exactly. And I think that the right way to think about this is that they can roll their dice one more time, the roulette wheel one more time, but that is going to be small stuff. It's going to be 1 or 2 small modular reactors in that sector that you talked about, chemicals, oil and gas, those sorts of things. They are going to roll the dice and do 1 or 2 or whatever, but that is not going to.
I don't think that's how they're going to make you. I don't think they'll do 1 or 2.
Right.
They have the answer to the big supply chain capability question that you were asking a moment ago. They have massive manufacturing capability, and the oil and gas industry, the chemicals industry, they're really good at organizing their supply chain to meet their needs. And I don't think
this.
No, they don't.
Microsoft doesn't make
I'm not
nuclear anything.
No, they don't. But they're really good at organizing their supply chain to supply them with the services that they need. Which doesn't mean they'll invest. It doesn't mean that they'll do it themselves. But it does mean that they'll send a signal which is large enough, significant enough that it will generate the investment in the supply chain.
Send the signal, and the supply chains will start responding.
Yeah.
But these things take a long time. And where we hopefully would be by 2030 is the critical decade in all of this.
Yeah.
Actually 2030 to 2040.
My phrase, the critical decade.
That is the one with, So
now we're in the critical decade because we're laying the foundations. And actually what we want to see in 2030 to 2040 is the delivery.
Right.
That's the delivery decade.
So success looks like laying foundations in the next 7 years. And I think that is the most that you can ask for from the nuclear sector.
But that's a huge amount of work, as we've been discussing. I'm not making any claim that we're going to be building thousands of reactors before 2030. The real question is, are we laying those major foundations?
So that now we know what you're going to come back in 2 years' time. I think it's 2 years. And we're going to see whether the foundations, solid, robust foundations, have been laid, or whether it's still in these cycles of talk and hype and attacking renewables and press releases and whatever, which is going on in parallel with a lot of very, very good and interesting things. Is that fair?
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Kirsty, thanks so much for coming on Cleaning Up today. It's always an enormous pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
So that was Kirsty Gogan, managing partner of consultancy Lucid Catalyst, co-founder of NGO TerraPraxis, and advocate for pretty much any form of nuclear power. This was Kirsty's second appearance on Cleaning Up. If you want to hear the fireworks when she first came on the show, look for episode 5 on the Cleaning Up website. That's cleaningup.live. Or find it on YouTube or your favourite podcast platform. Thank you for listening. If you want more from Cleaning Up, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn for news, highlights, my takes, and discussion. And do sign up for our free newsletter at cleaningup.live, where you'll find our archive of over 150 hours of conversation with extraordinary climate leaders. That's all on cleaningup.live. And finally, why not help someone else learn more about the net zero transition by introducing them to Cleaning Up? Cleaning Up is brought to you by our lead supporter, Capricorn Investment Group, the Lee Brake Foundation, and the Gilardini Foundation.